I'm going to call the meeting to order at 8:30 on the dot, yes. And roll call to my far left, Mr. Styrianides, Mr. Livingston, Ms. Melendez, Mr. Hempstead, Mrs. Smith, and Mr. Igneri, and with us also as well is Mayor Relling. And we have Corporation Counsel here with us as well, Mr. Coppola.
You want to do Tammy, Tim?
Tim. And yes, Tammy is also here if anyone's concerned.
Just Tammy.
Okay, first, while we have some members of the public here, I'd like to actually try to address some of the questions that came up. And first, I'll start just by reading the agenda item 1, Wall Street, West Avenue redevelopment area. The presentation by the agency counsel of the Second Amendment of the Land Disposition and Development Agreement by and between the City of Norwalk. I'll leave it at that. First, I'd like to bring up, I believe Mr. Nolan, you're going to first speak. Are you out there? There you are. There's a couple things I wanted to first touch on, and preferably in this order. We have a lot of questions about the designs, the aesthetics of the building, the materials that are going to be used. And we understand, there are limitations of structures there, it's been framed and so forth. But can you explain a little bit about the process and the developer's openness to possibly changing some of the materials and more to incorporate the historical feel of the district? Sure. Is that something that Mr. McClutchy and your client would be open to considering?
Yes. So for the record, my name is Peter Nolan. I'm with the firm of Carmody, Torrance, Sandeck, and Hennessy. I live at 2 Douglas Drive in Norwalk and have lived here my whole life. I've asked Todd McClutchy to come up here with me, but this is the beginning of the process. This is not a final approval of the actual development. We will have to go through design process with redevelopment and certainly with zoning. And the developer is most welcome to the idea of working with the community and the various agencies of the city and taking public input as to the design process.
Okay. John. And Mr. Livingston, you have any?
You've heard a lot of comments about this, and I actually agree with Mr. Bryant that this is the most important building that will be built in Norwalk in our lifetime. I think it's his quote. I truly believe that. And I think we made a lot of mistakes in the past. Look at 50 Washington Street. And these things live with us. This is being built in an historic district, right? And are you willing to have the Historical Commission have to sign off on this, your final design?
I don't think we would go that far, to be honest, because it's not a historical building, per se.
But you're in a historic district.
Somebody like Todd, who's worked in the community, is willing to give input as to the design. I mean, it's not a historic building.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. You're in a historic district.
Right. So what I hear Todd saying loud and clear is you have to make it fit. And I think the developer is willing to try to work with the community to make it fit, and that includes the historic district. If I heard Todd right, the last attempt was too far, that it was fake historical. He's looking for something that works and integrates, and I think the rest of the community is, and I think the developer is very willing to listen to that. The developer wants the best project they could build for the site.
One of the concerns I had was, I think Mr. McClutchy last time, I think your father, had said that he had picked new materials for this proposal, and then Mr. Hennessy in a Nancy on Norwalk comment, I think this morning, suggested in his language that this was an approved deal and therefore you guys are kind of tied into this stuff. And that really raised alarms to me. I heard both those comments suggesting that you think that what was proposed in this document is what you want to go with.
No, I don't think that's exactly
Design.
representative of it. There is a frame building out there, so there are certain aspects of that framing that cannot be changed and would be too costly to do so. But looking at different facade treatments and materials and colors are certainly things that we will take into consideration as part of the design review process.
And that's the heart of design review is exterior finishes and facades.
I mean, look, one of the things that I would like to see is, more brick oriented and less of the yellow. And one of the things that I did in the last couple of weeks is request the design for what we would have up if this project hadn't stopped. And frankly, I thought that was pretty horrible as well. However, what it did have was a lot of stone, which you have on Wall Street. It had a lot more brick, which you have, and had more cornices. Is that something that you would be able to incorporate?
Yeah, no, those are architectural features that we would like to include as part of the process, and we would like to get some of the input from some of the professionals and some of the neighborhood associations to work to enhance that.
Mr. Sirius?
We've heard a lot from the arts and the concern with keeping the arts in that area. Would you be willing to work with the Arts Commission and everybody else that's interested in keeping an art feel in that area?
Let me first say that somebody said, the developer previously said they would not consider anything about the arts. That's a direct misstatement of what Todd has said on the public record before, and I'll let him address it again, because very much do want to work with the arts community.
Yeah, I think that thank you for that question, though. That's a very good point, and we want to make sure that we enhance what is already in that neighborhood. So if there are arts and performing arts, whether it's fine arts, that we can bring to this property to enhance the balance of the neighborhood, it's something that we are willing to do and would like to do. We have had a number of conversations with folks already, and I think that many more can be had, including several of the folks that spoke this evening.
I think it'd be safe to say if this project were to move forward, that this, not just this committee, but the full council will be lobbying both the zoning and yourself to try to incorporate these changes to the aesthetics of this building. I can say with full confidence to expect that. Okay.
And let me just say, we would welcome input from the community. If they don't have to wait for a public hearing. If they want to reach out and contact us, we'll pass it along to the developer. We'll put them in touch with the developer directly. We want to hear from the community.
Thank you. Mr. Hempstead.
I'm trying to get clarity because the LDA is being amended, so the existing one's being amended versus the whole thing thrown out with the bathwater. So, number one, once the LDA is signed, at least in the previous one, the council was kind of done. It fell on the redevelopment agency, basically got to look at all the aesthetics, et cetera, building materials. If we sign the LDA without a garden center in it, and it doesn't have to happen, there's no restrictions in with the LDA. I don't know if Mario can chime in on that, if I'm correct or not correct, whether anything's changed, but I didn't see anything in the LDA that changed the overall LDA, so that would fall back to redevelopment agency being basically the gatekeeper, correct?
With regard to exactly which issue, as far as being the gatekeeper, just clarify for me, please.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm asking, it's design, the design goes after the council votes for the LDA and the redevelopment agency votes for the LDA. The previous one reverted basically all design approvals that go through, there were just certain suppositions, but have all been satisfied once they pass it. So I'm assuming the LDA would have to be amended if they wanted to put a garden-type cinema within their building.
Well, a few things. First of all, the zoning approval for this property has expired. So the applicant has to reapply with a new application to zoning for this project. And so when they go through the process of obtaining approval from the zoning commission, there are certain design review guidelines which will come into play and be administered by the zoning commission. So what's going to happen is that the zoning commission staff is going to issue reports with, which are going to consider various issues, including design, any concerns about design. Furthermore, our regulations, which I think many people may know have been the zoning regulations have recently been amended, provide for the ability for the commission to hire professionals to review design issues. And I believe it is section 118-1400 of the zoning regulations, which provide that at the cost of the applicant, the commission may retain an architect, an engineer, a landscape architect, professional land use planner, and other consultants to review comment and guide its deliberations. So to the extent that there are concerns regarding any design issues, the next step of review, if there's an approval from the council and the RDA of the proposed amendments to the land disposition agreement and loan recognition agreement, would be for the applicant to apply to the zoning commission. And during that process, the zoning commission can hire different professionals, presumably an architect, to assist with the review of any concerns about design.
But if the design criteria is, loose is not the word I'm thinking of, but kind of broad, you can wind up with the mall look. If I remember the criteria, if the criteria is the same as it was before, then the criteria was pretty open. It wasn't, like you can't, it's nothing that says you can't do X. It's very wordy, and I'm just trying to establish, if I can, and it's just that basically once it leaves the council's hands, it's out of its hands. And if the developer wants to put in, was amenable to putting in a garden-type cinema or some kind of arts cinema place, then the way the LDA is drafted, there's no requirement, number one. Number two, I guess it would have to come back for an amendment because it's not retail, it's not office.
Actually, I think that.
That's why I'm asking.
Well, the definition of retail has been broadened as a result of the zoning regulations, and I don't know if that's necessarily the case. If there was some art use provided within the main building, we may not have to amend the land disposition agreement or loan recognition agreement in order to allow that change of use. So I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I can tell you that there was discussion and negotiations for the last year, especially when we found out about potentially about the garden cinema property. There has been the request to consider having that type of use somewhere in the project. So I know it has been something that the developer has been at least considering. It's certainly a request that was made from leadership from the city and the redevelopment agency. I'd also just point out that in addition to the zoning regulation that I cited, the commission has the authority to refer the application to another agency, such as like the historical commission, although this is a new building, so I don't know if they would decide, I don't know why they may if they would decide to do that. Also, the commission, in conjunction with the redevelopment agency, conducts a joint review of the building design utilizing an outside peer review architect as part of the process as well. So it's a substantial process with regard to design review that will take place once a zoning application is filed.
No, I'm aware of that. I'm just making sure it's clear that it's basically out of the council's hand. It's going to have to adapt to whatever design guidelines are existing at the particular time.
And also, just if I can make a suggestion, the applicant talked about meeting with those who are in the neighborhood. I may make the suggestion that you just may ask the applicant about scheduling a meeting before they apply to zoning to meet with those who are in the neighborhood to go over design review before an application is filed.
I guess I'll address that. Would you be open to having some sort of public forum, public meeting with the parties involved to present the plan before it goes to zoning?
I think every good developer does that, and I'm sure we would do it in this case. I mean, there's no sense walking into a room where you don't know what the public wants, so absolutely, we'd try to schedule a meeting before a formal application is done.
Great. Do anyone have any more questions for Mr. Nolan or Mr. McClutchy before we get into the weeds on the LDA amendments?
Is there a drop dead deadline for approval? I mean, you know, it's kind of like, what's a million, a final offer kind of thing. So it's, it's final. It's Tuesday or never.
No, there's not a specific date. It's just a matter of getting the project reactivated again to make sure it becomes a viable development for the area.
So you're not in an immediate rush?
The condition of the building is in such a state that it needs to be addressed. It will continue to deteriorate, that it will not be salvageable at some point.
And I think the owner essentially wants to move forward as well. I mean, we're the developer, but the current owner is anxious to see something happens.
I would also point out that the city does have an active blight enforcement action with regard to the property, and the city, from the perspective of blight enforcement, has been encouraging the speedy completion of the building and to remediate any condition of blight that exists there.
All right, thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And with us tonight, I believe we have Caroline from Redevelopment's legal counsel from Shipman and Goodman that will be briefing us on the amendments. And before we get into that, it's been asked of me, and I feel it's also important to, as we know, the LDA, it's a considerably large document, and many members on the committee would like to get a real clear idea of what we're approving, what are the differences, what are the changes between what we had before and what we have now. So if you don't mind at some point touching on that would be very helpful.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I might suggest, because I've had this discussion with Mr. Coppola, I thought maybe we could just actually walk through every provision of this amendment. That might be an easier way to do it. I mean, I don't know how you plan to approach it, but I personally, and I'm sure others want to go through every single change.
Well, just first for the record, I'm not Carolyn. I'm Donald Gustafson. I'm a partner with Shipman and Goodwin, and my colleague Carolyn will talk. On your package, there's two documents. One is the amendment to a loan recognition agreement, which I'm going to talk about since it's the briefest document, and then Carolyn will do the hard labor work going through the amendment to the actual land disposition agreement. But I think dealing with the commission members, and what's here is the land recognition agreement really just comes out because the city of Norwalk, as well as the redevelopment agency, has an existing agreement under the land disposition agreement and with Citibank. Citibank has taken over title to the property. They have obligations, and we have obligations, meaning the city and the redevelopment agency. They took title to the property subject to the existing land disposition agreement. They have then gone out, they've negotiated, and they have selected what they've considered to be a proper, competent, credit-worthy redeveloper that they would like to cut a deal with to finish this project, and that is JHM and Todd and John McClutchy. Our obligation under the existing loan recognition agreement is we in the agency, and the agency has, I think, vetted and has approved, and this is the reason to vote, to go forward. Do we want to do this transaction that Citibank has proposed with JHM going forward? Our obligation is we have to act reasonable, and it's subject to the city and the agency's reasonable consent. On the land recognition agreement is just two simple things. They've made a proposal. We approve and are willing to proceed forward with the McClutchy as the successor and redeveloper, and McClutchy agrees to take title and proceed forward, subject to the existing obligations and the performance obligations under the redevelopment agreement. In part of the discussions between the agency and the city, and also with Citibank's counsel, there are certain amendments that we already know. But it does mean that there's a full application, a full zoning application that the public can comment on. It will be a public comment, a full site plan approval, and I believe the developer and its counsel has already made comments that they're receptive to some of the concerns already expressed at the previous public meeting. But as far as the loan recognition agreement, I'll be brief. All we're doing in this document, if you do proceed forward, to go forward with Citibank's recommendation, and I believe the agency and the city's recommendation to go forward with JHM as the proposed section redeveloper is, we're approving them subject to a zoning approval, full approval of the project, and that they are obligated to enter in and comply with the land disposition agreement as it may be amended and as the zoning approval, if ever issued, is approved by the city. And now dealing with the harder point on the land disposition and the amendments, my colleague Carolyn.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, before Carolyn speaks, I just wanted to point out to the public, in case people didn't know, that both of the proposed amendments to both the loan recognition agreement and the land disposition agreement were posted online as of last week, along with the notice for the meeting.
Good evening, council members. My name is Carolyn Cavallo. I work at Shipman and Goodwin with Donald Gustafson and agency counsel. I think the best way to do this is to go through it pretty much point by point. I don't think it'll take very long, but as it turns out, the more substantive points are actually at the beginning. If you don't mind, I'll just go through things, and as you have questions, just let me know.
Thank you.
As Donald said, we go through the LRA to get to the LDA. The Land Disposition and Development Agreement we'll just refer to as the LDA. We've made the changes to the LDA that we have to let the proposal go forward. Where we didn't need to make changes, we didn't. And what we have in this amendment are the changes that will conform just phase 1 to the plan and the proposal. None of these changes affect phase 2 and phase 3. We're only affecting phase 1 because that's what the proposal is dealing with. The first thing is the phase 1 redeveloper, who is JHM or a JHM entity, is assuming the obligations of the phase 1 redeveloper. So unless amended by this document, the obligations of the redeveloper under the LDA for phase 1 are being assumed by the new redeveloper. We are also amending the acquisition property to be just 17 Isaac Street. So to the extent that there are references to the acquisition property with regard to phase 1, it means only 17 Isaacs. The conceptual master site plan, we're not going to delete because it has information in there that exhibit about phases 2 and 3 as well, but we are going to attach a site plan that is going to be just the new redevelopment property for phase 1.
Do we have a copy of that?
We don't yet, but it will most likely be pretty much the same site plan that's in the proposal from the redeveloper. So that will be attached
So
and
the one we had at
finalized.
our last meeting is the one.
Yeah, well, let me just stop for a second, make sure I'm looking at the right thing.
Sure.
I have the designs. Is this it? Well, you can't see from there. It's-
The answer is, I believe the answer is yes. If I may, submitted on June 7th, 2019, were the site plans, along with a full description of the plan.
But to
And
be
it includes more than just one page. The plan is titled Wall Street Place Preliminary Design.
Okay, that's why I want to stop you there, because, so what you're including is, we're proposing to include, is the site plan, which includes garden cinema parking garage, right? That's the big change there, but you're also including the design we've been talking about, right? That's what I'm hearing?
The most important thing I think to add would be the site plan, the aerial site plan, which shows the location of the buildings. In the existing exhibit, it does show design plan, sort of the conceptual design plans for each of the different phases. And to the extent that we include those, it would be subject to design review. I wouldn't want to not include information that is contemplated under the term conceptual site plan, but for purposes of this amendment, the most important thing, I think, is to identify the properties that are going to be in and the footprint.
Can I add to Tom's question? I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like we're trying to figure out what level of commitment, what are we committing to in relation to the aesthetics of this building by approving the site plan? Does it bond us or hold us to something specific, or is it more of a generalized?
I think it's generalized, and Maria, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or Tammy, but since it's subject to a design review by both the redevelopment agency and the zoning commission, It's really conceptual. It's really to give an idea of the size and the placement
See,
more than actual design.
The problem I have with that is the language doesn't say that here.
Okay, so we can just include.
So you understand my concern, we've had all these objections, I have objections to design, and then if we just incorporate it, it kind of gets part, well, this is the document that was signed. it had
Yeah,
this
I
in
mean,
it.
quite truthfully, we could draft it and just say excluding architectural details or whatever, which will be subject to zoning commission when you just talk about the conceptual.
Yeah.
I think for that purpose of the LDA, they're just trying to get the parcels that are.
Well, that's what I thought,
phase
that's
one.
why I was sort of
That's
surprised
what
with the
it's ready
design.
to be.
I just want to be really careful that that's not some.
So at the time, can we just agree that we're talking about the footprint of the location?
I think, I think so, but I do know that in the existing LDA, there are more details if you look at that exhibit. So to the extent that we put anything else in, we can just say that the architectural details would be subject to full design review for zoning and redevelopment agency. So if we do put in elevations, which might be helpful for, bulk and size and location purposes, we can make it very clear that it would be subject to that design review.
If this does move into the council, can you have that by Tuesday?
That's fine, but furthermore, just to be clear, we're not locking ourselves into any specific design with regard to, for example, the exterior of the building. There is a design review process that will be administered by the zoning commission, as we discussed previously.
Yeah, I understand that, but the only point is, if once you memorialize something in a signed document, it gets additional weight. So I think either you exclude it or you're very clear that there's nothing about that that's binding on anybody.
Yes, clearly, any discussion with regard to design throughout this process has no binding effect, for example, on the zoning commission.
Right, and all I'm saying is
Part of their review.
that ought to be in there.
That's fine. Carol, that's something we could address, correct?
Absolutely.
That's not a problem.
Can I get clarification again?
Please.
Because if you're keeping that a portion of the LDA, then the redevelopment agency almost has final say, if I remember correctly, because they have to do an independent review of every material going on in that building, et cetera, right? If it's the same as the last process, is that still holding true?
No, the planning and zoning is going to require design review.
Right.
What we've done in the past year is had joint design review on big projects, and that's what would happen here. There would be one design reviewer that the redevelopment agency and the planning and zoning commission had agreed to, I don't remember when, over a year ago. It's DeCarlo.
DeCarlo and Dell.
DeCarlo. And that design review will come before the planning and zoning commissions and also before the redevelopment agency. That could happen in a joint meeting, that could happen separately, but it will be the same design review that is presented to both parties.
So, just take it a step further. The submittals will go in, as usual, as an exhibit, whatever's been in our packet up to this point. And I'm just going to make a comment about one thing, because this tried to happen once before. Right, you take the parking garage, and let's put the U back in ugly, okay? And somebody we've got one of these downtown that's concrete all the way as it is. And somebody thought at one point the Maritime Garage was supposed to be looking just like this too. Thank God, I have to say I was on the zoning commission, we forced them to put brick fascia on all sides, which makes a big difference in how that looks from sitting up as we talked one evening, right?
Take away that extra floor.
It would be one of my concerns moving forward, that great, and I'm gonna say kudos for moving through this, that at least through the negotiations on the parking, you've been able to factor in sufficient spots and gotten compensation for it. The cost of what it's doing it, as far as the price of something being eliminated, is another issue. But if that's an exhibit, like I said, let's put the U back in ugly exhibit.
Obviously, any of the drawings that we provided to you to date are,
But it's a
as
close
titled,
second.
they're preliminary, and in conceptual, and there will be a joint review process by the zoning commission and the redevelopment agency.
Right,
So there's nothing to force them to do that. They could say,
Yes.
Yes, no,
you can deny them because they didn't put brick fascia on it or some other facade on it.
I would take the position that the zoning commission would have the authority to deny the application if the application didn't adhere to certain standards as set forth in their zoning regulations, and certainly if it didn't satisfy the zoning commission as, for example, for concerns about design, then certainly I believe they would be well within their right to deny the application.
But if this is allowed, then it's allowed.
What do you mean by that?
If this kind of fascia is allowed underneath zoning regulations, and that's why I'm asking a question about denial. Can you force them to do something that is in the regulation as being acceptable?
Yes, because
I
there
get
are.
what you can throw out and say, hey, don't hold it.
I'll give you an example. If you have a subdivision application,
Yeah.
you have a subdivision application, I know this has been debated by at least one commissioner on planning commission, but if you have a subdivision application that complies with the subdivision regulations, you have to approve it. This application would presumably be special permit,
Yeah.
more likely. So when you have a special permit application, it's not, as of right, for example, site plan review. There are certain standards that the zoning commission could apply if it has concerns about various issues, including design. So I believe that the commission would be well within their right to deny the application if they were not satisfied with the design.
And what has typically happened on previous projects is that the design reviewer, who's a pretty tough reviewer, will go back and forth with the design team to get to a design that the design reviewer is comfortable going before the commissions with. And he or she will make the recommendation that it either meets or it doesn't meet the design guidelines that are set forth in zoning and in the Wall Street West Avenue redevelopment plan. And then the commissions have the
Not the same company.
the chance to do how they want to vote.
It's not the same company that did the mall, I hope.
What?
It's not the same company that reviewed the mall, I hope. And my apologies to the chair, I did not make a meeting before this. I probably would have asked some of these before, but work comes first. My day job.
And by the way, I would just point out, since
Yeah.
we talked a lot about the guidelines, there are design guidelines set forth in the Central Business Design Guidelines, which accompany the West Avenue Wall Street redevelopment plan, which is dated March 13, 2019. So with regard to the concerns that you have, I think it's well worth it before Tuesday that we take a look at
So-
those design guidelines.
So can you provide that as additional material, because you've asked for something else too, right? I think as of tonight, right? You want the word fix. Can we get design guidelines kicked in with this?
Yeah, we'll get everybody a copy of the design guidelines for the Central Business Design,
CBD.
CDB, and also the West Avenue Wall Street redevelopment plan.
Okay, can we allow Caroline to proceed with going through the LDA? Okay, thank you.
So the project site will actually be that first page, the actual site plan, the map. Because the definition of the project site currently has reference to both phases 1, 2, and 3, and we just want to refer to the specific site plan, which is the map, just of phase 1. When we're talking
It's
about
probably fine, but could you guys include that for Tuesday,
that. Absolutely.
both those?
Yep. Redeveloper property is redefined as the Wall Street property and 17 Isaac Street. It was a longer list, and just for purposes of phase 1, we're redefining it. The changes in the parking, now we're on section 6. The changes in the parking is now we have a 2-story parking garage with 140 to 151 parking spaces with a minimum of 50 public spaces. Before, we had a minimum of 100 public spaces. So that's the change there.
Well, actually, I want to spend some time on this one.
Sure.
So as I look at this, they can build between 178 and 201 spots, right? That's what it says, if you add the two numbers together. So you do 40 to 50 in 61, and then 138 to, so how do we decide that number? How's that number decided?
That
The
number,
final number. I mean, it's someplace in that range, right? How do we get to that? How do they get to that?
that'll be based on the feasibility, what can be put on the space. So as they go through the planning, their parking consultant will figure out what the feasibility is, how many spaces can be included within the garage and and on the property.
Okay.
It could be as simple as the fire marshal walks in and says, I want a standpipe right next to that spot over there.
Right.
It suddenly takes the spot off on every floor. So you go through a normal plan trying to get everything you can, but then sometimes when you lay it out, it turns wrong, or you know, somebody walked in and said, no, I want that here, not there, I want a wider
Or the
striped
striping
area,
different.
whatever.
But the
Or I want
bottom-
additional handicap spaces than what the code requires for. So I mean, there are a lot of things that, but it's usually not, you're gonna lose 30 spaces out of it. Usually you lose maybe 5 or 10 depending.
But the bottom line requirement is that they have, 50 public minimum.
Correct.
And
50.
whatever the zoning requires for the apartments, I take it?
Correct.
Okay. Do these numbers include the on-street parking on Isaac Street?
No, they do-
The on-street parking that's the 36 plus or minus number. That's on-street, that's not part of this, section. That's separate.
Well, if we can talk for a minute about that, because, so that is required parking, right? Is it?
Is it required?
Just to be clear, there's a requirement for 100 public parking spaces. On-street parking spaces that are being provided are referenced within, have been referenced within the proposal, but they are not, they do not count towards the obligation for 100 public parking spaces.
Okay, but do they count, do they need them to satisfy the zoning, the modified zoning rules?
No, they don't.
They would not be able to use public parking spaces to satisfy a requirement for zoning for
That's what I'm sure
parking.
about that, okay. So, last meeting, I asked a question about the map, which shows Isaac Street is one way. Still don't know the answer to that, how people get out of there, but that's another question. If you were to make it two-way, you do lose, I think, 18 on-street parking spots. That's what I count from your map. Now, of course, it could be up or down. So, what does that mean? What does that do? Does it have any effect on anything, other than people not able to park in the street?
That affects the 36 parking spaces. It affects the 36 street parking spaces. It doesn't affect the 50 minimum.
Okay, then I'm confused about the 36. So what is the 36 again?
That's what the parking consultant expects to be available as on-street parking.
Okay, so if only 18 are available, what does that mean?
It doesn't affect the LDA required parking.
It doesn't affect the LDA required parking. It doesn't affect the required parking from the zoning commission. We didn't have to mention the on-street public spaces that are going to be added, but we thought to do so really as a reference more than anything else, because realistically, you're anticipating they're going to be there. But as Doug pointed out, once they get to the zoning review process, for various reasons, the parking layout may change, whether it be comment or concern from the fire marshal or for other reasons. So that's why there's some.
I appreciate that. My question is, do they matter in terms of the LDA? The answer is no.
No.
And they don't matter towards the zoning requirement either.
Correct.
Okay, that's all I want to find out. And I'm sorry, one last thing, I think Doug answered it, but you don't have any, the sole minimum is 50, and if anything, in the 50 to 100, the balance, you have to pay for the ones you don't do, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And there's obviously an incentive for the developer to try to
Right.
provide as many public parking spaces as possible to save on the $22,000
Space.
per space fee that otherwise would be paid for every space less than 100 that's being provided.
So more than likely, we'll be getting more than the 50 spots.
If they can, yeah. And that's just going to be based on feasibility.
I think there was an estimate that was presented to you,
75, right?
somewhere over 70. I thought it was like around 72 is the number that pops in my head, somewhere around there. But again, in fairness to the,
that wasn't final. So
yeah,
they
in
could-
fairness to the developer, the commitment is to 50, subject to what zoning is willing to approve.
Section 2.1B2, the change to the residential unit section is we're going from 102 residential units to 101.
Mr. Hempstead, you had a question?
No, finish out the parking. I want to just go back to one, on the previous page. I wrote myself a note here, just ask a question.
Please proceed.
Okay. The change to the retail space, first, we're going from a little over 20,000 square feet to 11,506 square feet of retail space. And this definition includes the street activation language from the zoning now. So what we have is, that the retail space may include the personal business service establishments. So that language mirrors the zoning regulation change of what could be the ground floor of the Phase 1 improvements. And that they have the obligation for it to conform to the zoning regulations in that regard. So the square footage is the biggest change there, the reduction in square footage.
Can you, that be inserted that, where we had said retail space 12,000, I'm trying to think of like an and/or whatever, art cinema, art complex, something.
If I could just address that, the zoning regulations have broadened the definition of retail use in that area, and it does include that type of use.
Yeah, I have it here.
Cultural arts and
Cultural
entertainment
arts and
facilities.
entertainment facilities.
Yeah, so it is already in there.
Yeah.
It's already here.
Recreation.
So that would already be-
Commercial recreation things.
That would already be permitted as part of retail use.
Please proceed.
There's a small change to the rooftop, the occupant accessible rooftop. They're just characterizing it as recreational space. It may or may not include a garden, so there's just a small tweak to that language. The live workspace is deleted in its entirety. That's 21B5. And then 21B6, which was the section on the Globe Theater, was eliminated for Phase 1.
What's the live workspace? You said it was eliminated?
Previously, under the LDA, there was a requirement that the redeveloper shall construct not more than 10,828 square feet of live workspace on the ground floor of the Phase 1 improvements. It goes on, but that's what had been previously contemplated for the ground floor of the Phase 1 improvements.
In
And that's-
addition to the 20,000?
No, it was part of the
Well-
20,000.
It was part of it?
Yeah, it was part of the 20,000, but that's not in this proposal.
Okay.
Section 3.2 was amended to change the timing for the construction plans and when things have to be submitted and started. We went from within 60 days of execution of the LDA to within 180 days of the Phase 1 redeveloper obtaining final land use approvals. That's the biggest change in that section. So that's the timing on Phase 1 construction plans.
Mario, do you have any estimate of how long it would take to get the final approval?
From zoning?
Just the whole process, these final approvals. And forget appeals and all that stuff. I mean, just on a normal course.
Under the normal course of business for a project like this, which is going to have a lot of people who are going to be participating in the process, members of the public, et cetera. Once the application is filed, maybe a fair estimate would be maybe between
3 to 4
3
months.
I was going to say 3 to 6 months. There's certain statutory deadlines for the zoning commission to comply with in order, once the application is filed, to have it adjudicated, although the applicant could consent to continuances or extensions of those deadlines. But ultimately, my estimate would be 3 to 6 months from the date that it's filed.
And do you guys have any sense of when you would file, assuming this were approved?
August.
I think the goal is
The August submission date, somewhere around the
August, September.
10.
Everything's in the works and the development team is working on the applications already.
So, just to follow through logically, so you start in August, assuming everything goes well, it'll take 6 months, and you have to start by August of 2020, right? Right? And that's the deadline.
Got it. If you're
Yes,
if you're
from
talking
the
6
date-
months, correct.
To answer your question, yes, from the date, from the date of final land use approval, which would be from the zoning commission,
Yeah,
it's
again,
180.
ignoring any
Right, so we're thinking 180 days for the
Yeah.
approvals and 180 days for
So
this.
it's a year,
Yeah.
a year from August.
Which you will be.
At a minimum.
Yeah, no, I understand.
It could be less than that, but it can't be more than that.
But actually, you're talking August as in a week from now? Assuming this is a...
That's what we're
August, September.
that's what
Okay.
we've been saying. They've been saying maybe. But they've been working on it. I mean, it's a big application. They haven't been waiting to work on it, so.
Well, we've been talking about this for years, so I mean, you think they'd be a little ahead of the game, okay. Any more questions, Tom?
No.
Please proceed.
Sure. Section 3.6, small change, but if a parking consultant is hired by the agency to review the work of the parking consultant of the redeveloper, that cost of that consultant will be carried by the agency, not the redeveloper. The next two changes are just cleaning up definitions to make sure that we're talking about the definition of final land use approvals, which is changed up here in section 3.2, so that's just a carry-through change. We're trying to catch the instances where phase one has to be dealt with. Section 3.9 is new language for the evidence of equity capital and mortgage financing, which is responsive to the funding that the redeveloper is going to have for phase one. So for purposes of phase one, that section is changed.
Is Citibank a party to this?
To the LDA?
Yeah, because it
no.
says Citibank has approved, so they're not saying they approved, the developer's saying they've approved, right?
So, no, Citibank is party to the LRA amendment,
Yeah, but not
just
Correct.
not the LDA.
So when it says Citibank has approved, it's the developer's word that they've approved. I'm not saying they haven't approved, I'm just saying it doesn't mean anything.
I just want to know exactly which line are you talking
This is about 5 lines down in the first paragraph.
Last sentence.
It's not last sentence. Citibank has approved the phase one developer and expects to provide a construction. I mean, that's not coming from Citibank, that's coming from the developer, right?
Well, we can tie it into the LRA amendment there, because the LRA makes it clear that Citibank has approved them.
Right, I believe at the hearing, the planning committee hearing, the developer did say that Citibank approached them and that they had.
No, I don't dispute it, but it's not, I mean, they're not saying this doesn't really mean much. Legally, this doesn't mean much, right?
But if we add in the reference to the LRA,
Okay.
it's a cross-reference to the document that Citibank is signing.
Okay.
So we can do that. Next section? Okay. Let's see.
Doug,
Yeah,
yeah.
I got two.
Okay.
And I'm not too sure. On section O, 7, I guess it'd be 7. Next one is 8 notices.
Page 7.
The parties acknowledge the exhibit C1 through C4 are no longer accurate reflect obligations for infrastructure and utilities. Mine is more of an economic question. Are there anything in the LDA that would obligate the city any further than it obligates on the previous LDA as far as what it had to provide for infrastructure?
No,
No.
no.
And I have one way back in the beginning. Can you explain H? The agency is willing to approve equitable amendments to the developer, covenants upon the terms and conditions contained within. So could somebody kind of explain that a little bit further, what that means?
What page is that?
Okay, that's page
Page
2, and that is.
Section 36.
First
Yeah, so
section,
it's in the
that's why I
preamble
raised my hand.
paragraphs. It's the agency is willing to approve equitable amendments to development covenants upon the terms and conditions contained herein. So that's just setting up what the following agreements are, because the following agreements are the equitable changes to the LDA.
So there's
Because-
nothing outside of this agreement that
Correct.
they could agree to?
Correct.
Okay,
So-
the agency carte blanche, well, that's why I'm reading it this way. It says the agency can.
And that's what the rest of the document is, are those changes.
So
That
should,
is contained.
and I go to our attorney, should it contain in there, contained within this LDA?
It says
It
contained
says
area.
contained
It says,
herein.
yeah, it says,
Oh, okay, but if they wanted to change an obligation in here, they have to do X, could be parking spaces, could be something else. And they came back, and the agency was amenable.
the
Can they
answer,
do it underneath this contract?
it says the agency is willing to approve the amendments upon the terms and conditions contained herein.
So
So
strictly within this LDA, they can't go out, they can't arbitrarily.
it's with it- this,
This
is,
It can't arbitrarily, they come back and says, hey, we're still 20 spaces short, can you shorten up the city's obligations on spaces?
legally, the answer is no.
Okay.
Practically speaking, there's no way they would do it.
Okay.
But
Okay.
but
Answer my
legally,
question. As far as legally,
it's
answer
a
my
fair question. yeah.
All right, thank you.
We were on 3.9. Were there any more questions on that? Back to page 5. Okay. 312A is another change to the timing of the Phase 1 improvements. Let's see, where are we going from? So it's the Phase 1 improvements, construction of the Phase 1 improvements on the project shall be commenced by Phase 1 redeveloper within 90 days after they obtain final land use approvals. And previously, it was 90 days after the above approvals, so it was a slightly different definition of approvals. And previously, it was, and shall be completed within 36 months. And now we're changing that to, and shall be completed within 24 months of commencement.
Well, is that consistent with G? We have to start within 180 days? And now you're saying it's 90 days?
I think the issue is the 90 days is also qualified
By
by
the building
getting,
permit.
by the building
Building permit.
permit.
Okay, I wonder if that was it.
also. So they can't just get zoning approval, then
It's
wait
building
a
permit.
year.
I thought that might be the answer.
Yeah.
The other question is, the Phase 1 improvements, how's that defined? I mean, we already have an infrastructure there. So are the improvements, I mean, where do you start? Is it the same definition as was in the prior one?
Now, Phase 1 improvements is the changes to 2.1. Those are the main components of the changes that define Phase 1 improvements: the parking, the units, the ancillary
I just want to make sure
services.
they don't get credit. They can say, well, we started that before, what's there, right? That doesn't count. We're starting we're starting from the new project, if you will, is that time period, right?
Right, their work starts with their work.
Right, so, okay, I just want to make sure.
I would also just point out, there's certain remediation work that could be done to secure the asset that's there before they've completed going through the zoning approval process. They've been in contact with the zoning department and also with the building official with regard to some of that remediation work to secure the property.
Yeah, because Phase 1 improvements is as redefined. So it is reset with this amendment.
Okay, good, thank you.
The next is section 4.1. And this is the section with regard to infrastructure improvements and funding. This is the $4.4 million available for infrastructure improvements. This addition or clarification just states that the city funds, so section 4.1 is hereby amended such that the city funds, which is the 4.4 million, up to 4.4 million of infrastructure, as such term is defined in the LDA, or the applicable portion thereof shall be made available to the Phase 1 redeveloper to the extent the Phase 1 redeveloper can evidence to the city and the agency that the city funds or such applicable portion thereof is necessary, that's a typo, necessary to pay for city infrastructure improvements actually constructed within Phase 1. So we haven't changed the process by which those funds are allocated. We've just narrowed it so the focus is that those funds are available to the extent they're used in Phase 1.
Doug?
But I thought the original intent with that, as part of the infrastructure improvements, even though it was tied to Phase 1, was a consideration that Phase 2 was gonna move forward. So the design of some of that stuff would have taken into consideration Phase 2 and Phase 3. If you're putting in new sewers, you're putting in new drainage. That was part of the master plan.
Yeah, it's being
So,
redesigned.
Are you defining this as that, and I'm just trying to use a phrase, that's where the end of the street goes, that we're responsible for ending the street at, and I only care about the pipe going in there and anything after that, the city's gonna have to do on its own? Or the next redeveloper?
I don't think I understand the question. Could you further explain it? Are you, with, the limitation here is that for the 4.4 within Phase 1, is that correct?
Correct.
So, as far as, that doesn't further obligate the city in any way with regard to any additional potential phases of the project or other properties?
No, I know that, but I'm saying the intent.
Which is beneficial to the city.
beginning was this, if they had to bring new cables in, or new infrastructure for internet, et cetera, it was going to service, the end game was, it was gonna service Phase 2 and Phase 3 as part of the project, and that's why the city kind of agreed to it. My question is now, we've taken that lump sum of money and basically said, it's strictly for infrastructure for Phase 1.
There was a
I
determination.
know it's all Phase 2 and Phase 3, but they own the project.
A number of years ago, I think it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I believe there was a determination made that all of the 4.4 under the terms of the then LDA were, I guess, eligible for the developer in Phase 1, and I think that was a letter agreement or an acknowledgement letter that was executed by the agency in the city. I think it was 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, at the time that the LRA was amended.
2014,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah. So,
But we're amending it anyhow, so I don't want the developer or the city to be short-sighted in the sense that we're only gonna go up to a certain line and then like the next guy comes along, like, well, we had an opportunity to provide, I'll just use the internet, because that was, one of the services we talked about trying to expand in down Wall Street for the area, and just say it's not a priority, so the rest of the project, or however it's gotta be running, is just gonna be running and dead-ended and have a nice day versus
I'll
have the building.
I'll defer to Mario and Tammy, but the way that we drafted this language with Tim and Tammy was to, not that those improvements would only serve Phase 1, but that they were actually constructed within Phase 1, so that they were accomplished within Phase 1.
it could be for the benefit of properties that are outside of Phase 1.
Right?
But we don't have the design for Phase 2 and Phase 3 anymore, because it's not there.
But the sewer line's gotta be removed.
There are obviously,
I guess.
there are obviously
I guess moving
issues
forward, it'd
with,
be nice when they go through the construction documents for this area for drainage and sewers and bringing new communication lines in, et cetera. It's considered what the area needs in that eventually redefined, redeveloped area versus just trying to focus on Phase 1.
so you're talking about from a capacity standpoint, which makes perfect sense.
Right.
Obviously, you're in the business, so if you're gonna, once you're building it, it makes sense from a capacity standpoint to be on the,
To accommodate future development.
on the higher end.
Consideration for it, we got a street going in,
To
next to the
accommodate
theater or
future
something like that.
development.
Okay, all right.
Within reason, right? Because your example,
Well, yeah,
your example in Orange
I
was
just
the two
want-
letters where certain infrastructure was to be overbuilt, so
Right.
that's, right? I mean, it's within reason.
No, but I also don't want it all to be so focused that nobody else can do anything else, so you're left with the street all beat up on the other side of the property line. So,
Understood.
The next one is Article 19, which is the events of default. We are referencing the events of default in the loan recognition agreement, which will control, because this redeveloper is being brought in through the loan recognition agreement. So we're just saying, to the extent that there are any conflicts between the two sections, the loan recognition agreement will control. O is Article 20, which is the disadvantaged business enterprises requirements and milestones. What we are doing is sort of, again, a narrowing or a shifting. That the requirements of the DBE will apply to the Phase 1 redevelopment on a going forward basis, since they weren't in control of the construction that happened prior to now. So the requirements and the judgments of whether or not they're living up to the requirements in Article 20 will be on a going forward basis for the work that they do from now going forward. Article 23 is another cleanup change. It's just to the extent that any time the redevelopment plan is referenced, we're referencing the newest redevelopment plan, not the one that was in place when it was first signed. So that's a definitional change. Q is pulling in, just making it clear that the real property tax phase-in is applicable to both parcels that are in the new Phase 1 property, the new redeveloper property, which is 61 Wall Street and 17 Isaacs. Article 26 is the sustainable design requirements. And for that, we're just making a statement that to the extent that any sustainable design elements were included in the building to date, it will go toward the score for sustainable design. So to the extent that there's anything that fits those requirements that's already been built, it'll count toward the score. Those are the major sort of substantive changes to the text of the LDA. The next section is where we sort of carve out what is not applicable to Phase 1 or to the Phase 1 redeveloper within the LDA. So first one, Section 2.2 governs Phase 2 improvements, so it's not applicable. Section 2.3 deals with the Phase 3 improvements. Section 2.4 is a requirement to assemble independent parcels for Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3. So that's not applicable to just the Phase 1 redevelopment. Section 2.5 is now superseded by the parking requirements that are in the new amended 2.1. The Section 2.5 is public parking and temporary public parking. So the parking requirements for Phase 1 redevelopment are now only in 2.1. Section 3.3 is Phase 2 construction plans. It's the analog for Phase 2, not applicable. Section 3.4 is the Phase 3 construction plans. The timing, same thing. It's just with regard to Phase 3, so not applicable to Phase 1 redeveloper. Section 312 B and C are the commencement and completion of Phases 2 and 3. Section 4.2 is the Academy Street extension provision. Section 4.4 is the redeveloper guarantee. And any reference to the redeveloper guarantee of the payment of debt service payments is not applicable to Phase 1 redeveloper, because the infrastructure improvements do not need to be obtained by bond financing. They've already been raised and allocated. Section 4.5, that is with regard to the acquisition of real property for city streets and sidewalks. we're limiting that to, as it relates to the Phase 1 redeveloper property. Article 6 is with regard to the budget and accounting for city acquisition expenses. And for Phase 1, there are no anticipated city acquisition expenses. So that is not applicable for Phase 1. Section 7.1 and 7.4 are just applicable with regard to Phase 1 acquisition property, because that's the section on property acquisition. Article 9 is conveyance of property. This is the Isaac Street Municipal Parking Lot provision, not applicable to Phase 1 as modified herein. Section 24.2 is another section on the financial covenants that are required. Not applicable because our Section 3.9 controls for Phase 1. I think this was brought up a little bit before, but Exhibits C1 through C4, these are the infrastructure and utilities lists, which can't be updated right now because the plans aren't final. They have to go through zoning and they have to be responsive to that. This is an acknowledgement that they may change based on the development of the proposal and the approvals that are obtained from zoning. So they may change, but if they do, it would be through the full process that they're going through for design and and the applications for approvals. And that's it for the changes to the LDA.
Any questions?
Yeah, has any consideration being given to how do we avoid getting the situation we're in today? I mean, I think we all expect that even if approved, it'll be done and all that, but they expected that in 2007 too. So is there anything we can do? Has it been considered to sort of tighten up the restrictions or the requirements to make sure that we're not stuck like we are today, waiting years for this type of thing to happen?
Well, I will reference one thing that we have, and one way in which we addressed sort of being able to know that we're starting and going forward is when you talk about the financial covenants, the language in section 3.9, it's a condition to the approval of the redeveloper. It's a condition to the approval of JHM or JHM's entity that they have that funding, that they have the LIHTC incentive equity, and that they have the Citibank financing. So they're not going to be in a position, because previously, you know, the way that the language was that if they weren't, they'd be in an event of default under the LDA, and we didn't want to get into that. So their approval as the redeveloper is dependent on having the funding and the ability to move forward.
And when will we know they have the funding from the state?
I don't know. Do we know what the timeline would be?
I think the developer could probably answer the question about the date by which we would anticipate confirming the state funding.
I mean, the question is, what if they don't get it? Just this sits here again for another, this agreement just sits here for another, forever? There's no, the point is, there's no time frame in which they have to get these approvals in this agreement?
Mr. McClutchy, do you mind coming down to speak to this, and if you could better clarify?
Just so I'm clear, which approvals are you referring to?
Well, I'm just hearing about this, that you're going to, there's a condition to approval that you have received the funding, the financing from the state, I guess, as well as other funding, right? That's what I just heard?
The state,
funding from the state is already
private and
approved.
public. Could you please, I think would be helpful is, could you please explain from a timing standpoint, the process for obtaining the state funding and also the funding that you'll be obtaining from Citibank, which has been described previously to you as, I think, about $50 million of fresh capital from Citibank, and also give a brief description of how the tax credits work?
Right, so there's several things. You've got the DECD and DOH funding, which is already in place. It's been approved. We have to draw down on it, that's all, so to start the project. In terms of Citibank financing, Citibank is committed to us that they're going to provide the They're going to buy the bonds that we sell, which is the underlying debt, permanent debt for the project, as well as the construction debt. So they're going to cover all of the permit and construction financing. And they're also going to purchase the tax credits to create the equity for the deal. So the way that works is the state has an allocation of tax-exempt bonds under the private activity volume cap. This qualifies as a private activity. The state allocates a specific amount of bonds to this project. With that, automatically comes a 4% tax credit. So Citibank is committed to buy those tax credits, and that provides the equity for the deal. Does that answer your question?
Yes and no. I mean, I understand the financing, but my question is a what if? What if you don't get it? And how much time do you have to get all this lined up? For Citibank, are we going to have a commitment letter at the signing of this? Just, what if you don't get it? What happens?
Citibank is committed to do it, so we can talk to them about how they
Well,
want
they're
to.
not signing this, are they?
I mean, I can't speak to how they are going to evidence that in writing to all the parties, but we can ask them about that.
Well, it's a simple question. I mean, I understand this is a condition to approval, right? You just said that? So then, how long do they have to satisfy the condition? It's a simple question.
I don't think it will take them long to satisfy.
It may not. I fully expect you can do it, but I want this to say you have to do it in a certain period of time or it's over. I just don't want to get in a situation where you say you're going to get it, and I believe you, and then a year from now, we haven't gotten it. And so we're stuck here a year from now.
Can I make a suggestion? With regard to the volume cap, which is relevant for purposes of confirming that the money is there and available for the 4% tax credit program, that was verified by the director of the redevelopment, well, now the previous director of the redevelopment agency. He confirmed that with the state of Connecticut. Let me ask this of the developer. Could you please provide to us tomorrow copies of documentation that you have confirming the state funding to date that we could forward to the council before the next meeting?
I don't know what we have right now. The answer is we'll get it for you. I don't know if I can have it to you by tomorrow.
Well,
And then also-
that's not what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think, just real quickly, I believe what the member's looking for is, once you get final land use approvals, you gotta start within 180 days.
Right.
I think what he says, assuming you get approval, you submit your zoning application by a certain period of time.
Oh, I hear him saying.
Yeah, that's not what I'm looking at.
Question is-
I just heard that this is it's a condition to approval of a redeveloper, right? That they have these funding sources, right?
Yes.
I heard you, right?
Yes.
And so I'm saying, how long do they have to get it? It's a simple question.
Well, I asked for, if we could have some documentation with regard to the commitment so far from the state. Could we also, let me ask this of the developer, get from Citibank before Tuesday in writing verification as to what the process is going to be for financing with Citibank? I mean, one reason we do feel confident is we've actually met directly with Citibank, whether it be here in Norwalk or at their headquarters in New York. And Citibank has, at the highest levels of the bank, has confirmed their commitment to the financing of this project with this developer. But
Then then everybody should be easy to say.
so by the meeting on Tuesday, could you please try to get could you please get documentation from Citibank confirming?
We'll request it tomorrow morning.
That won't answer my question, but that's nice. Well, all I'm asking is there be a deadline? I mean, why is that difficult?
Mr. Hempstead? Sorry.
In the previous, or the existing LDA, there is a period when they're supposed to present a letter of financing, proof of financing. It's in a timeline, it's not by a certain date, but it's in the timeline that after X point and Y point, they have to provide evidence of them secured financing. I remember the previous owner walked in with a letter from Citibank saying he was in default of his $5 million loan. So, the existing LDA has something in there, it's just a question probably to mimic it in this one. And I think that's what he's asking for. It's just,
The normal
it's
course of business.
part of the approval process.
Right.
So, like you have, I don't know if we're keeping the same design criteria, they have to submit a certain design by a certain period. I know they're trying to fast track that, and I get it, which means you're gonna have to get your financing, which I'm assuming if the bank has gone this far, they're going with it. But he's just asking for, at what point in your sign-offs or approval process, you have to produce.
Right, I mean, you can tell me it takes 6 months, okay. I want to know what that date is.
Right, so it normally takes place within 90 days of the time you get all of your land use approvals in place.
So you would be willing to commit in this document, you know, within, give it a buffer.
Within some period of time after that, yes.
Yeah, okay, then I think you should add the language.
That's fine with the existing language.
Which is 180 days.
All right, yeah.
Carolyn, could you please address Councilman Livingston's question with regard to the commitment from the developer with regard to securing financing within a certain period of time of obtaining the land use approvals?
Is that the trigger point, final land use approvals?
Yeah, and the definition of final land use approvals includes any appeals thereof, as is the case in any agreement like this.
Right, so what is?
The question is, by which date, could you please confirm for us by which date the developer is obligated to have obtained the demonstrated evidence of the financing?
There wasn't a time period prior. The failure to do so was an event of default, but it was something that they had to provide during the process of approvals, but there wasn't actually a time period.
So the question now is, could there be a time deadline set for providing evidence of the financing for the project?
I mean, I'll answer the question hypothetically. Citibank will agree to that. We will talk to them about that tomorrow. I don't know what their timing is going to be, but my guess is it's going to be somewhere around 90 days.
Well, build the buffering, I'm not.
I understand.
You just want a limit, that's
I
all.
want a limit, I don't want to be here.
I'm not trying to make an artificially short limit, just
Yeah,
some
exactly.
limit after final zoning approval, financing has to
So
be
we're not
placed.
stuck 2 years
Where
ago.
the LDA was, existing one.
We have no problem with that. We don't want to be here 2 years from now, trust me.
No, I'm sure you don't, but, you know, we didn't want to be here for Coco today,
I
so.
understand.
I think getting a commitment letter is not going to, if that's what we're talking about, is not going to be.
It's not going to do it, no.
What?
I mean, that doesn't solve my immediate question, no, but that,
It's your fault, we
so that's why that document doesn't mean much to me. I
blew this
don't-
shit 10 years
Could
ago.
you further explain what you're?
Well, no, I like what we said, it's just the time period. I mean, you can show me the commitment letter, but I want a legally enforceable agreement that if they don't have it in a certain period of time, we can tear it up and walk away.
Well, they'd be in default, and there's a process for default
All right,
if they don't have evidence of financing by a certain date.
okay, I understand.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll add to the new language in 3.9 that after a certain period of time.
After a certain period of time, there must be sufficient evidence of the commitment of financing from all sources.
Okay.
Do you have a question, Mr. Hempstead?
Just for information, is there sufficient time, or can there be sufficient time to get a red line copy of the existing, because we're modifying the LDA, so other conditions that are not in this backup pre-exist this, so can we get a red line LDA for our packets?
You want the entire LDA with the red lines?
You've been.
Yeah, so
This is
we
like
know
a
where the
500
changes are,
page
because
document.
some of this references certain points. right?
You have been provided the existing LDA to reference with the amendment, and that's generally how, when I'm looking at an amendment, I'm generally looking at the existing document and then the amendment side by side.
Right.
Are you asking that we redline the existing document?
Well, how
You're asking-
you?
That's generally how I read them.
So I guess the question is, on a document before the council on Tuesday, are they getting the full LDA to approve again?
No, those terms have already been agreed upon.
So I guess
We're
what
only-
I'm asking for, is it possible, we get it all the time in ordinance with other things, can we get a red line copy?
Well, you were provided the existing LDA.
Yeah, I know that.
So are you asking us then to have the existing LDA mocked up essentially with red lines on like a track change?
For whatever's being offered here, yeah. that's possible.
That's something we could do by Tuesday, I think.
I don't have it as a Word document.
The existing LDA? No?
So the answer is no.
And not if we don't have it in Word form.
I was your live red line tonight. I kind of went through it.
I don't have it either.
We'll figure it out by Tuesday. Let me see how we could address that concern, that question. Again, you have been provided the operative document,
I know.
and the way I read it,
This makes life a little bit easier.
I read them side by side, but let's see what we could do.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? Seeing none, as I've said in the past, I do believe it's important that the entire council has a look at this, and I will be calling for a vote, and if the vote were to pass, I would like a full presentation to the entire council, because many have questions, many have concerns, many have, input that they want to say. So I hope to be in touch with Tammy and Mario, and hopefully we can get together and come up with a plan on how to proceed. That being said, I will now call for a vote to advance Municipal Holdings LLC's proposal, including the proposed amendments to LDA, the LRA, and Phase 1 of the Wall Street Place project to the Common Council for approval. Would someone like to move that?
I'll move
Mr.
it.
Sirenides. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions?
Till I get to Tuesday. I want to see the final document.
Thank you all. Motion to adjourn?
To adjourn.